Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio Chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Thursday, December 17th, and we will hear the presentation, Equity Planning. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the chat box located in your GoToWebinar tool panel. And for your content questions related to the presentation, again, just type those in the chat box in your GoToWebinar tool panel, and we will answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. And just to help us out, if you can, please also put the name of the presenter that you would like to answer the question. It just helps when we're fielding all of the questions at the end during the Q&A. Coming up next on your list is our list of our sponsoring chapters and divisions for 2020. Thanks to all those participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to members. Today we are sponsored by the Mid-Atlantic Planning Collaboration, which is a joint venture of the Maryland National Capital Area, Virginia and West Virginia chapters, along with the Maryland Department of Planning, Maryland Planning Commissioners Association, Rural Planning Caucus of Virginia, and West Virginia University's Land Use and Sustainable Development Law Clinic. The intent is to address topics that may be of interest to people involved in planning at all levels across multiple regions. And it has been a pleasure hosting this series of sessions. Today is the last one in the series, and we hope to have you all back again next year. This was a really great lineup, so thank you. Coming up next on your screen is a list of our final webcasts for 2020. So there's one more and it's tomorrow. You can head over to ohioplanning.org/planning webcast to register for that. We are booking well into 2021, and I will be having those sessions available within the next week or so for you to register for, again, on our webcast webpage. So head over there so that you can see our great lineup for 2021. Today's session has been approved for 1.5 AICPCM credits, and to log those credits, just head over to planning.org and log into your MyAPA account, and from there you can either search by today's title or event number, both of which can be found on our webcast webpage. Be sure to head over to Facebook and like us. That's where I post any important information like date or time changes, and also when there are new sessions available for you to register for. So be sure to like us and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We record all of our sessions and make them available on our YouTube channel. So by subscribing, you'll get notified when we post new sessions. And if you haven't visited us over there before, we have over 300 sessions available for you to view. So be sure to head over and subscribe to our channel. Again, when you think of those questions, just type them in that chat box in your GoToWebinar tool panel, and we'll answer those, like I said, at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Joe Griffiths, who is going to kick things off, and I am going to close out my screen. So you're not supposed to be seeing anything but all of our faces. So don't think that you're missing something. But I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Joe to kick things off. Okay.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you to APA Ohio for supporting the Mid-Atlantic Planning Collaborative in our series of webinars. We've really enjoyed it, and don't worry, we'll be back. We have a meeting on January 6th, so just around the corner to talk about the next series. So it's not the last you've heard of us. My name is Joe Griffiths. I am the Local Assistance and Training Manager for the Maryland Department of Planning, and I helped coordinate and work with our great panelists today to bring together this session for you. And now I want to give them a chance to introduce themselves. First, we'll start off with staff from Baltimore City. First, we have Stephanie Smith, the Assistant Director for Equity, Engagement, and Communications. Stephanie.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you, Joe. Thank you to everyone that took time out of your day to join our panel today. As Joe mentioned, I serve as an assistant director in the Department of Planning in Baltimore. My focus is on equity, engagement, and communications, and I'm excited to share with you some of the things that we've been doing in Baltimore and some things that we're planning to do in the future to make sure that we're as responsive as possible to all communities and all the neighborhoods we serve. So I'm very happy to be here today.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. Next, also from Baltimore, we have Lena Brave, City Planner.
Hi, everyone. So I am part of Stephanie's small but mighty team, and we will be tag teaming a little bit today as we go through the presentation.
Thank you, Lena. Now we'll move over to the Albemarle County. First, we have Siri Russell, Director of the county's Office of Equity and Inclusion.
Thank you, and happy Thursday to everyone who's joining us. I'm just like my peers and colleagues here, also very excited to be with you guys today, coming from Albemarle County, Virginia, where we've really been working hard to really start living our mission more fully, and our mission being to enhance the well-being and quality of life of all of our residents. And one of the ways that we do that is through our planning exercises, and I'm really honored to be here today with Rachel Falkenstein to talk about that.
Thank you, Siri. And yep, nice transition. The next one is Rachel Falkenstein, Planning Manager of Comprehensive Planning for Albemarle County.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Siri said, I work closely with her office, but in a different department of Albemarle County in community development. And we work on our long-range planning documents that really think about the community's vision and quality of life well into the future. So I'm excited to be here with the panel and honored to get to work with Siri on some of this important work.
Thank you, Rachel. And our last panelist from the Eastern Shore Land Conservancy is Darius Johnson, Communications Manager.
Good afternoon, everybody. Like all my fellow panelists, I'm equally as honored to be here. I'm a native of the Eastern Shore. I'm from Kent County, Maryland, smallest county on the Eastern Shore. But one thing that I really do love about my job is it gives me a chance to serve the communities I grew up in. So I'm really looking forward to talking about that today and how we're just trying to make equity a fabric of who we are and the work we do.
Well, thank you, Darius, and thank you to everybody on the panel. We hear from all of them today and their extensive expertise. Just give an overview how the session is going to flow. We're going to have an introduction, and then we're going to go around. They're going to be short presentations followed by a dialogue between the panelists themselves. And then we'll move on to the next. We'll do that for each presentation, and then again, we'll get to your questions at the end. So I'm honored to introduce the topic, but I'm going to keep this short because we want to get to the experts. So the historical legacy and enduring injustice of systemic racism in American societies are undeniable. The compounded and disproportionate impacts of COVID-19 and the political and economic oppression demonstrate how the decisions and actions of those in authority at all levels can deny communities of color equitable access to the benefits of citizenship. Recent protests and demands for justice around the country in response to the murders of American citizens have not uncovered anything new, but they have once again compelled the country to engage in sincere and open dialogue about persistent inequities around race. The planning profession is guilty of contributing to this legacy. Through unfair housing policies, the citing of environmentally damaging uses that threaten the health of our most vulnerable populations, exclusionary zoning, capital investment and disinvestment decisions, infrastructure development, and many others. Therefore, we as planners are similarly compelled to engage in a dialogue about equity. The panelists leading this session will explore how some communities and organizations in the Mid-Atlantic, as they introduce themselves, are proactively addressing this legacy and ensuring that equity is included in the planning process from community engagement through development review. For context, APA's Planning for Equity Guide defines equity as just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential, unlocking the promise of the nation by unleashing the promise in us all. Other planners and leaders in the field of equity may define it differently, particularly stressing the distinction between equality and equity. I would like to start by asking the panelists to define equity from their perspective or from the perspective of their organizations. And we'll start off with Baltimore City.
Thank you so much. So we have an equity statement. As an agency, we also have a citywide equity definition. But before I go into both of those, I want to make it fundamentally clear that one of the mistakes that are often made, not only within planning or any other sector that's addressing concerns of equity, is sometimes the conflation of the terms equality and equity. And in many instances, when you divide up resources equally, you're only furthering and exacerbating existing inequities. So it's really about getting relief, support, and resources to the communities and the places that need it the most. But I will just briefly share the equity statement from our planning agency in Baltimore. And this was something that was developed with the entire agency staff. We looked at equity visioning statements from other cities across the country, and we worked together to land on this. And Equitable Baltimore addresses the needs and aspirations of its diverse population and meaningfully engages residents through inclusive and collaborative processes to expand access to resources and power. Actually, it was power and resources. But I want to just emphasize that that last part, to expand access to power and resources, was of critical importance to our staff, because oftentimes engagement is usually at the most shallow stage of simply informing people that something is happening. And we wanted to make sure that our vision of Equitable Baltimore wasn't simply informing people about what was happening, but allowing them to eventually experience self-actualization around what they want as a community and have access to the power and resources to make that a reality.
And Stephanie, I'm just interjecting. On your screen, you can see this. This was actually from a presentation that we had a couple days ago around equity, and it stuck with me, and I saved it, and I sent it out to probably 50 different people because it really identifies, it really shows you visually the difference between equity and equality. So I just wanted to post that up there for everyone.
Love it. Love the picture.
Alina, did you want to add anything before we move on to Albemarle? Nope. Okay. All right, we'll move on to Albemarle County. Your definition?
Thank you, and we'll probably be brief because I think we'll co-sign everything that Stephanie said, so I'll put that out there first. I think I would only note that for us, we've really tried to connect how we talk about equity to our mission statement. So we really talk about equity as all community members having access to the community conditions and to the opportunities that are needed to experience optimal well-being and quality of life as defined by that community. And so ours, we really tried to connect to the mission, because that's for us overarching and the thing that sort of connects all of our local government organizations together. But I love your inclusion of power in your there. That's awesome.
Thank you. Rachel, did you want to add anything, or we'll move on to Darius?
Sure. So I'll co-sign what everybody else says, because I definitely support those definitions as well. And I'll also be transparent in saying that at Eastern Shore Land Conservancy, this is a new process for us, essentially. So, this is a working definition for us, and a working process that's never ending. But basically, how we look at equity at ESLC is just ensuring that everyone has a chance to benefit from the land that we protect. But also that means that we constantly and consistently recognize when we are using or misusing our power to impact the Eastern Shore quality of life for all people. And also making sure that we have the moral courage to do what's right for the common good. But the main thing I really want to emphasize is just that power dynamic, because oftentimes we misuse our power without even realizing it. Oftentimes we use our power not to the fullest extent. So there are different ways that we can adjust that power dynamic to, establish more equity, in our organization and in the work that we do. So that's something that we're going to consistently work on.
Thank you, Darius. So I hope that the audience keeps those definitions in mind as we move along through today's sessions and see where they can make the connections. So I think we're going to start off with Baltimore City, telling us about some of their initiatives. And I think the panel can turn off their cameras now.
Okay, great. Thank you everyone for joining us. So we're going to discuss our equity action plan and our equity committee and some of the parts of the plan we've been able to implement thus far, and some of our plans for monitoring progress moving forward. Next slide. This will just be kind of what we'll review, kind of give you some background about how our agency got involved in this type of work. We'll go over some of the goals of our equity action plan and then share some resources. Next slide. Next slide. So yeah, so one of the things that we do, not only within our agency, but in our interactions with the public and through some of the projects that we are involved in with the public, is that we feel like it's very important as an agency for us to be fundamentally transparent about the decisions. I'm sorry, Alina, I think you're, yeah, there you go. About how there are certain things that happen far before any of us were born that have planted and sown the seeds of inequity, and that we've inherited these legacies, and we have to have an awareness of those legacies in order to actually effectuate change and to build trust around communities that have been harmed by these legacies. So I wanted to show you quickly, this is the 1910 New York Times cover on Christmas Day, and it discusses that Baltimore has tried a drastic plan of race segregation. It noted that the Oriole City had adopted the most pronounced Jim Crow measure to date. And I think that is an important place for us to start when we're dealing with community, is for us to recognize that there have been systems, policies, and procedures that have been not only employed, but attempted to be employed and just slightly modified to promote racial separation. And in this instance, a Black attorney wanted to move into a very stately street, McCullough Street. At the time, there were no other Black residents on the street, and that simple act led to a city council representative, the city council, and the mayor to put forth this ordinance. So ultimately, by 1917, that particular effort was found to be unconstitutional. However, there are certain other layers to efforts to separate people. So I bring your attention to the map. And this is the 1937 residential security map that oftentimes is referred to as the redlining map for Baltimore City. And when you look at the red portions of that map, which are largely, and this is a regional map, this shows Baltimore County and the surrounding counties, but the heart of the map is the city. Those red portions are East and West Baltimore, and these are some of the areas of our city that continue to have some of the most strained housing market realities, and also are, experiencing the related stressors of disinvestment as it pertains to social and political access. So though these are things that predate us, we've inherited their legacies. Next slide. So we actually launched our internal agency planning committee in early 2015. And what's interesting about this is that many of your participants may know that in the spring of 2015, just a bit after this, there was an uprising in Baltimore related to the death of Freddie Gray, a gentleman who was injured in the custody of the police and unfortunately lost his life thereafter. So, it's important for folks to know that we launched this before that, but the uprising and kind of what it laid bare only reinforced our commitment to addressing equity through our agency's policies and procedures. So we discussed, at that time, there's things we need to do to advocate, to ensure that leadership within the agency, we're definitely going to embrace some of these changes. We needed to foster a dialogue, not only for our staff, but we also need to figure out how some of those dialogues could also expand our ability to connect with the communities we serve and the other agencies we work with. And so we ultimately devised an action plan that identified priorities for us, and then we developed work groups related to those action plan priorities to really operationalize them and make them real. And I want to say that I am incredibly indebted to the staff at the Department of Planning for creating not only this committee and this action plan and the subsequent work groups, but it was because of this staff-driven effort that was given support by the past director that they asked that past leadership to hire someone at a senior level to implement the action plan. And I owe my very job to my colleagues for doing so. Next slide. So we utilize an equity lens as we do our work, and I know a lot of times people go, well, what is that? It's a term that we hear used frequently. And for us, an equity lens is a tool that's helping us to improve our planning, our decision making, and our resource allocation, because we do have a unique role within city government because we manage the capital planning process. and capital budget for the city. That resource allocation piece is where we come in there, and leading to more racially equitable policies and programs. Because we live in a city with a high rate of racial segregation, we really can track and map the allocation of power, resources, and other things in a way that might be very different depending where you represent. So the equity lens we use came from the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. And if you're wondering, why is the Baltimore Department of Planning using the Urban Sustainability Directors Network equity lens? It's because the Office of Sustainability for the City of Baltimore is a division of the Department of Planning. And in this 4-part equity lens, it prompts you to ask yourself questions as you are developing programs, implementing programs across these four categories. First, structural equity. Are there historic advantages or disadvantages that have affected the residents in this given community where this project or this particular set of activities are happening? Procedural equity. This is where I think oftentimes people are not realizing the fullness of their power, but there are many times that residents have not been authentically included in planning processes, not only at the conception stage, but through implementation and evaluation. And these are elements that don't really require a lot of change. It's just, how do you do business within your agency? What time of day do you do things? How do you engage people across various platforms? And I know that COVID-19 has challenged all of us around that engagement piece. And distributional equity goes back to what I mentioned, how are civic resources and investments explicitly accounting for racially disparate outcomes. And when you look at the segregation that may be present in your community, it can be even easier to assess that. And then lastly, one of my favorite pieces of this equity lens is transgenerational equity, because too often we do not ask ourselves about any undue or unfair burdens we're placing on future generations that are less likely to be present at the policymaking or planning table. Next slide. So we have an equity assessment program law in the city of Baltimore that was passed in 2018. And one of the hallmarks of that law is that it required agencies to do some things differently in their bill reports to City Council. So whenever an agency reports to City Council on a proposed ordinance or resolution, that agency shall include in that report results of an equity assessment of the proposal's impacts on its operations. So our interpretation of this is that this gives us an opportunity to think about our staff reports across the commissions that we support and to see how we can institutionalize a reporting out on some equity metrics so that we can not only assess trends over time to see if there's maybe something that we're not accounting for when we're just looking at projects on a one-off basis, but when we look at a portfolio or a catalog of activity across our Historic Preservation Commission and our Planning Commission, for example, over a calendar year, can we see trends that maybe beg some intervention, a policy intervention, an update to the zoning code or something of that note? So the equity assessment program began with essentially every agency just creating a baseline analysis of where they were with this work, with the training their staff had been exposed to on equity, and what their operations and capital projects were doing to include considerations. And in the subsequent years, which we find ourselves in now, we're required to actually report out annually our efforts to implement our own agency equity action plans, and every agency is expected to have an equity coordinator, analyze their capital budget for equity, and also submit an annual report to the mayor and city council. Next slide. So the 5 goals of our equity action plan, which I must say predates the city ordinance, is right before you. I won't read it word for word, but I think one of the things that we really thought were important is that we need to just have deeper and more robust engagement across communities that have not been served as robustly as possible, and really deepen our commitment to ensuring that they are fully integrated into our planning processes and outreach. We also wanted to make sure that we were working to improve the pipelines in terms of fellowships, internships, and hiring to build a staff that more adequately reflects the demographics present in our city. We also wanted to make sure that there's so many things that you can be doing within an agency through planning that, again, don't involve a law to be changed, but how can we always develop these programs and processes with an eye towards inclusion, to making sure that that folks, regardless of age, ability, education, and access to Wi-Fi, are able to participate authentically in the things that we're accomplishing and are charged with accomplishing within our agency. And then number 4, which is very unique to Baltimore City, is using an equity lens to prioritize capital investments. And then lastly, evaluate just all of our internal policies and practices related to equity. Next slide. So in our equity action plan, goal number 1 about improving and increasing dialogue between underserved communities. Next slide. We have some projects. I want to give an opportunity for my colleague Alina to discuss the Planning Academy that we've been conducting, because she is a key player in pulling this Planning Academy together. And we want to make sure that she gives the opportunity to explain how she pulls it together. Alina?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Sorry about the slides moving around a little bit. So the Planning Academy is something we have been running for a couple of years. It is a 6-week cohort-based program, and the vision for it is we want to build community leadership around urban planning generally, but very specifically the zoning process and development review using a Baltimore lens. We have 3 goals. One of them is to really build community, and that's why we use a cohort model with 30 participants. Another key goal is to connect advocates and neighborhood leadership to the resources that the city and our department offers. And one of the things we stress is we really want the participants to bring back the information they learn to their neighbors and to their community. And then the third goal is to truly empower residents to shape the future of their neighborhoods by being able to participate more actively in their community, as well as the processes internally happening in the city around development. This is a brief overview of our application process. We're actually currently recruiting.
Alina, we can't hear you. You're a little muffled.
Oh, sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. So we are currently going to be reviewing 170 or so applications for the spring. And we basically, the application consists of 4 questions that are short essays. And then we provide what we would describe as kind of bonus points related to equity based on where an applicant is located in the city. Just very, very briefly, we've had 110 participants so far. We keep the cohort very small, 30 per group, in order to really stress that community building aspect. Initially, we held the sessions weekly for a couple of hours. We tried something a little bit different this fall because we did it virtually. So we broke it up thinking that people wouldn't want to sit with us for multiple hours in an evening on their computer. We had 2 sessions per week that were a little bit shorter. On the left is a breakdown of the demographics of our participants. They have largely reflected the city demographics. So as you can see on the bottom, we had about 77% of our participants so far were African American, compared to about 66% of the city residents. The age kind of is all over the map. So we have participants ranging from their early 20s through senior citizens. And then one thing where we are kind of uneven is we tend to get more female applicants and female participants. But we do track these numbers very carefully because we want to make sure that the participants reflect the demographics of the city of Baltimore. Also very briefly, this kind of goes through our curriculum. We always start with a discussion of the history of racism and how it affects urban planning specific to Baltimore. And then from there, we delve into kind of the nuts and bolts of zoning and development, and we spend quite a bit of time on that. So that's really the center of the program, that zoning piece. We have now been doing for a couple of sessions a site tour of different development sites around the city, where we bring in a developer and have them talk and take our group around. A unique aspect is we also look at the budget process, both internally, the capital city budget process that our department works on, as well as the city's operating budget. We talk a bit about equitable development. That was kind of a reaction to discussions related to gentrification and interests of the group. So we really try to bring that conversation in towards the end. And then new for this past year, we brought in real estate development and finance, and we brought in a really great local speaker to break that down for our participants as well. So I'm taking it back to Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Alina. So we just want to discuss, you know, our next couple of goals, and really, you know, in the respective time, we're going to summarize and really focus on our capital budget efforts, as well as our staff report and equity. So next slide. So yes, so right here in goal 3, we wanted to figure out how we could actually create more of a dynamic and robust impact from our staff reports, because we actually do track a good deal of racial equity information and neighborhood character information in our staff reports, but how it's presented and how it is you know, pulled together, it's not necessarily in a way that is highly replicable for review as you do a look back. So we wanted to enhance the existing format of our staff reports, particularly for our Planning Commission and our Historical Preservation Commission, because they are meeting every 3 weeks and on matters that are really advancing, you know, the land use system, and encourage more discussion. So right now, we actually just left a meeting of our Planning Commission where they were giving us additional feedback on our proposal to modify staff reports in this way. And one of the things that you know, people are usually worried about is you do not want to require regulators, which in many ways our commissions are a regulatory function, to make decisions that are outside the scope of the regulations. So we are not doing that. We're just adding additional context and information and putting that also in a mapping format so that we can track trends over a calendar year and over years to see if there is an instance where certain types of neighborhoods or certain parts of the city are facing a certain type of phenomenon, and does that beg a specific intervention to address that, whether that means updating the zoning code or creating another policy or procedure. Next slide. So one of the other aspects of the staff report that we really want to have more fidelity to documenting in a very easy to focused way is around developer public engagement reporting. We have not really created a way for us to look back and see what the trends and what the levels of public engagement by developers really looks like with community members, depending on the scope and nature of the project. We know that depending on the nature of the project and the scope of the project, it will beg a certain type of engagement level. But even with that being said, we haven't really tracked the quality of that engagement. And we want to use this as a way to better inform how not only to support community members as development comes to their community, but also as a way to help our developer community, because all developers are not coming with the same experiences or the same resources. So we want to ensure that everyone has the tools they need to best, to best engage with the communities in which they're planning to operate. Next slide. So these are some of the aspects of the proposal to update the staff reports that you can see right here. We want to look at some data in the beginning and have that data kind of formalized across all staff reports. We of course will retain narrative observations by our staff as it pertains to the specific projects at issue, but we really want to have components around the impact, the equity impact, the engagement piece, and then the internal operations of our agency as we respond to these projects as they're being developed. Next slide. So then the last part, and I'll summarize here. You can go to the next slide, is around using the equity lens to prioritize our capital investments. On the capital budget, as many of you know, is the improvement in long-term, physical infrastructure like roads, monuments, public buildings, parks, etc. So we actually initiated an equity analysis of our capital budget several years ago and looked at the distribution and look at the various equity indicators rather to understand who is likely benefiting from our capital improvements. And I think one of the things we realized is we needed more data. There were some folks that were requesting budget support for batch location data, saying a quadrant of the city needed funding, and that wasn't precise enough precise enough for us to map. So over the past 2 fiscal years, we've seen a great improvement in agencies giving us location data so that we can more adequately assess the impact of our capital investments. Next slide. So this is the latest analysis that was conducted in part by the University of Baltimore. So we looked at a 3-year average of our CIP allocations from fiscal year 14 to 16, and then also fiscal year 15 to 17. So we looked at the per capita spending and how that was allocated in neighborhoods within the highest percentage of Black or African American residents. And we noted it was only half of that which was allocated to areas with the lowest percentage of Black or African American residents. So, you know, there's a lot of reasons for this. Some of it could be based on the fact that investments in city buildings tend to be in certain parts of the city, and that may be in parts of the city that do not have the highest concentrations of Black residents. And there's some other things that we were looking at too. So we realized we needed to tease out and look at more neighborhood level investments too. Could you go to the next slide? So yeah, so when we looked at the neighborhood level, we saw, you know, using this heat map function, that there's some opportunities for us to better explain what we're investing in, but to also get more input from the community about what they would like to see investments in. One of the things we realized is that some of our investments, like in a bridge or in a park or even in a reservoir, those have regional or citywide benefits, and sometimes they can skew the amount of funding that appears to be going to a neighborhood that's not getting neighborhood level investments like that playground or that very specific investment. So these are some of the things that came out of our equity analysis. We realized that we needed to, one, get a better sense of the conditions of our buildings across our inventory across the city. So we were able to convince the Department of Finance in the midst of a pandemic to continue to fund a new position for someone that is just focused on asset management as it relates to this effort. So we're very pleased that the Department of Finance sees that there is cost savings in the future if we have a better sense of the quality of our inventory on the front end. We also have launched a preliminary review process where we're bringing together all the capital planners across all the agencies to evaluate and score using an equity rubric every proposed request for the capital budget. And we're doing this in conjunction with our mayor's office as well as representatives external to city government, because we really want to see if we can build forth a tool and equity rubric that would be really substantial and beneficial to us as we move forward with the capital planning process in the next fiscal year. So we've just launched that oversight panel, and they are currently assessing and scoring proposals as we speak. Next slide. So yeah, these are just some resources if you want to follow up, if you want to learn more about our planning academy, about our equity committee, or just about our CIP equity analysis. And I'll see if I can even drop those in the chat feature as well for folks. So thank you for your time, and sorry for going a little bit over.
Thank you, Stephanie. If I get the panel to turn their cameras on and see if anybody has a question for Stephanie or feedback for Stephanie or Elena.
Yeah, I have a question about the transgenerational equity. Just wondering if you could just dig into that a bit more, specifically as to how you get people to understand that concept and how important it is. I know that's something that at Eastern Shore Land Conservancy we could benefit from a lot, and we're trying to get folks to understand that generational impact. So would just love for you to unpack that a bit more.
Absolutely, Darius. One of the things that I think is interesting about the piece you're talking about is that it's the one area where, quite frankly, even community groups are not doing any better than anchor institutions or government around including young people. It's one of the things I think we're unified in that kind of defect. So one of the things that we've been thinking about is the Planning Academy. We've always, as you saw with the age spread, we've always been trying to make sure that it wasn't just people over 50 or just people over 40. We wanted to make sure that we had younger adults even in the room. But we also wanted to launch this summer, but because of COVID, we had to recalibrate a youth planning academy, because they care about the cities and communities they live in, and they have great ideas already, but too often we discount them. We assume what they want. And one of the agencies that I think is at the forefront of maybe having this conversation is Park and Recs. Because a lot of times adults have an idea of what they think a young person would want to do in Park and Recs that is dated and is based on their childhood or maybe their adult children's childhood. So we're living in a time now where maybe a young person doesn't want to go to the rec and play badminton or necessarily even play basketball. They might actually want to do some e-gaming. They might want to do some, record, they might want to record music. They might want to do something tech-based, not necessarily sports-based. So I think that, certain agencies, because they have different types of customers in a certain way, their ears are a little more to the streets of what young people want from city government and city response. But I think that one of the tools to bringing young people into planning conversations that's really important is our schools. Because some people are never going to join a community association and some people are never going to have time for some of these other affiliations. But schools are hubs that bring together not only young people, but families that are sometimes not connected to these other things that we often over rely on to get a sense of what communities want. So we've been trying to do a lot of listening sessions and things with schools as partners, not only to hear from students, but also to hear from parents that might be too busy in other parts of their life to engage in some of the other types of groups we rely upon. I think that we also might want to consider bringing younger people onto our planning commissions. I know that we have an alum of our planning academy who is on our planning commission. He's not a child, he's probably in his early 30s, but that's still so much younger than oftentimes is courted for those opportunities. So I think we just have to kind of think outside of the box and also use social media. There's no reason why a city as small as Baltimore has a planning following on Facebook bigger than Chicago or bigger than Seattle. It's only because we've really invested in having a social media presence, and Instagram is your friend. We all work in something that's beautifying or improving the built environment. It's made for Instagram, and younger people are on Instagram. So I think there's a lot of low-hanging, low cost to free opportunities for us to be more visible in our work.
Well, thank you, Stephanie, and thanks for the follow-up, Darius. I think we're going to transition to Albemarle now.
While we're transitioning, I did just want to say, Stephanie, I really, Annalena, I really appreciated your presentation. There was so much really exciting work being shared there. So I know I plan on asking some questions later that I didn't ask right here.
Are you able to see my screen, Siri?
Everything looks great.
Yep.
Okay.
That's good.
All right, awesome. So I think I'm going to start us off. We've already introduced ourselves, but here representing Albemarle County. You can go ahead and flip to the next screen there, Rachel. Nothing I'm going to say on the intro slides, all that interesting. So we wanted to give a little bit of background about Albemarle County and about where we're at as a community. I'm not going to give a ton of demographic information or that sort of thing because you all have Google, but there's a couple of things that we wanted to point out. One of which is, we are a county. We're a mid-sized county, so we're not terribly large. We've got a little over 100,000 humans in Albemarle County, Virginia. And I wanted to point that out because so often we see so much of the really exciting and really leading work around equity happening in cities. And so we really wanted to just spotlight that there are opportunities for those of us who work for counties to do that work as well. Another thing about Albemarle County is that we have a little over 700 square miles of land mass, but 90% of that is rural. And that's a point that I really wanted to drive home because, again, I find that sometimes the conversation around equity do end up centered on cities, and it can be hard to figure out, what work can a rural locality really be doing? And the answer to that, as Rachel is going to point out here shortly, is quite a bit. We've really had to work to embrace the interdependency between our urban and rural areas. We're almost 50-50 population in the ways that that's dispersed. And so it really creates some interesting challenges for us in Albemarle County that may be reproduced in other localities as well. The other thing that I point out about Albemarle County, Virginia, if you're not familiar with us, is that we are really steeped in history. I know that isn't necessarily unique, but it is worth noting that we have multiple World Heritage Sites within Albemarle County, including 2 presidential homes. And so there's a really, I think, in some ways, unique attachment to the land and to a particular identity or history that we've grown comfortable with retelling and claiming, that sometimes runs counter to our goals and intentions around equity and inclusion. The last thing that I'll say about Albemarle County, Virginia, is that we are on our growing edge. Darius mentioned earlier being new to the work. I would say we're new too, and we're right up on the edge of comfortable growth, right? You're at the point where it's like almost a little bit painful. I would say that's where we are right now. And so what Rachel will be sharing during the rest of this presentation is really about how we're living within that growing edge and trying to push ourselves further as a local government institution and as a community towards really embracing and fully living our mission that's really service to all of our community in an equitable fashion. So I'll shut up now and let Rachel get to the main event.
Thank you, Siri. That was a great way of describing kind of where we are with this work on our growing edge. We are a little bit past starting out, and we're not quite as formalized as you saw with Baltimore City. We're kind of somewhere in between. But I wanted to share with you all how we've started and how we've gone about this work so far, because I do think it's helpful to think about where you can start. You're not going to have a full formalized process on day one, but you can start this work right now. And I'll share kind of what we've done and some of the lessons learned from our work so far. So I'm going to talk about kind of 2 streams of work we've done in our long range planning program. And when I say long range planning, I really just focused on the visioning documents for the county, our comprehensive plan, our master plans for our specific development areas, and other long range documents like that have a time frame that we look out into the future and try and set a vision for our community of 20 years. So they're really visionary, kind of high level documents that inspire people to kind of think about what we want to be. So the first stream of work that we've been doing along the work of incorporating equity into planning is what I'm calling education and research. And this work is really kind of focused on 3 main goals. As we were kind of reflecting on the topics of equity and racism in our internal team and long range planning, we reflected on the fact that we don't have a really strong grasp of the history of planning in our locality and what forces shaped our current land use and zoning maps. We know about some of the racist tools and segregationist tools that have been used in the past, but the local information is something we feel we need to know more about to understand kind of how we can begin to kind of redress and dismantle some of this. And so that's kind of the first main goal of doing this education and research piece. Secondly, we want to bring awareness to other histories. As Siri mentioned, we have a really prominent historical narrative in Albemarle County focused around, pre-colonial and colonial times and the presidents that lived here, the white landowners, the wealthy landowners. But there are other histories here too that are really prominent. Interestingly, Albemarle County at the start of the Civil War had 14,000 enslaved people living here, and that was more than half the population at that time. So there's quite a bit of other history here, and we want to bring awareness, we want to learn about it, and lift it up in our planning and policy decisions. And then lastly, and definitely most importantly, is dismantling and redressing any racist and harmful practices within our policy and regulatory tools. So a couple of examples I'll share, and I don't have time, unfortunately, to talk about all of these, but there are a couple of projects listed on this slide of kind of work we've done around educating ourselves, educating the community, and doing research to better understand the planning past in Albemarle County. The first 2 bullets are focused on kind of planning designations and historical designations we have within the county, and doing research about why were these designations chosen for these particular sites and not others. And so a current master plan we're working on, there's a historic district in one of our development areas, the community of Crozet. It's a National Register Historic District, and there's an African American community right adjacent to that district that was left out of the National Register district because it didn't have the structures there didn't have the same integrity. They weren't as intact as the structures within the historic district. And so doing that research and kind of understanding that past, and then thinking about, well, what planning tools can we use? What policy tools can we use to focus on these other areas that are just outside of the district? Similarly, we have this Crossroad Communities designation in the county, and some research and partner with Siri's office and the University of Virginia. We had a student do a research project to identify how our Crossroads communities, the selection of them seemed to intentionally leave out some African American communities within our rural areas. So starting to uncover that kind of complex past is a first step of this work, and important for us to start to move forward and think about how we want to change and update our land use and planning tools. So some just lesson learned for this stream of work of the education and research. Lean on partners. It's not something our small office has the capacity to just spend time on doing all of this research. That it's complex, it's layered, there's so much out there. We're fortunate that we have the University of Virginia in Charlottesville and Albemarle, but there are other partners too. If you don't have a university in your locality, high schools, other local nonprofits we've worked with to do some research projects to help answer some questions we have. The second point is learning is ongoing, and it shouldn't be a reason why you delay work, because it's so complex and so layered that we may never know the full picture of why decisions were made. And then lastly, the point I'll make is communication is part of the equation, and this goes back to the complexity as well. Storytelling is a really awesome skill and an important part of this. It's not just about educating your staff, but educating the community as well, so they can understand why it's important to relook at some of these policy decisions that have been made in the past. And moving on, the second kind of stream of work that we've been doing to start off on this work has focused on community engagement. So I won't read all these, but I'll point out the goals on this slide are right now kind of informal internal goals we set for ourselves just within our team. We're getting to the point where we can hopefully formalize these in a policy document, but we felt like we needed kind of some guiding principles for us to help us make decisions about how we do community engagement. And so we use this framework and hope of having more equitable processes and accessible processes for members of the community to engage in our work. So a couple of engagement examples I'll provide of work that we've done along improving equity in our engagement processes are on this slide. And I'll share that, as I said in the beginning, these are long-range planning documents that we're talking about, and the processes themselves can be 2 and 3 years long. And so I have two kind of slides I'll share on this topic. The first one is about planning projects that were currently underway. So when we started this work, we had several projects that were currently underway, and we didn't really want to wait to get started. And so we just kind of figured we'll start doing some things on these projects that are midstream to see what we can do to improve engagement, improve equity within our engagement processes. So just a couple of things we did were similar to actually Baltimore, but not quite as robust, is an educational tool where we developed a game for people to try and understand how land use and zoning work together in our locality. And we brought that out to the community, and we developed online tools and a video as well to try and pair with that. But I love the idea of a planning academy, making this a more formalized process. So that's definitely something I'll take away from today. But the other point I'll share on this slide is just trying to think about engagement differently and going to where people are rather than expecting them to come to you. So we've identified different group meetings where we asked if we could come out and just have a few minutes to talk to them about a project we were working on, look for community events that are already happening that you can show up at. In the time of COVID, see if there are any community group Zoom meetings that you can jump on. Those are things we've done that we've been able to increase our outreach and increase the variety of people that we've been able to reach and improve our hopefully equitable outcomes from these processes. And then secondly, those are the projects that we're currently underway. We have 2 projects we're about to kick off in January where we really wanted to be more formal with how we incorporate equity into our engagement process. So we're working with Siri's office to pilot a new tool that her team has developed called an equity impact assessment. And that's just a series of steps we go through to make sure that each step along the way of our planning process, we're thinking about equity. So we're getting started with that. And as part of piloting that tool, we've identified a couple of things we're going to do to incorporate equity in our engagement. The first is about recruiting membership and using demographic data to do so that the people who are on our advisory committees and are kind of making recommendations and advising on projects represent the community that we are looking at with our long-range project. In addition to that, we're providing a stipend for participation because we acknowledge that not everyone can just volunteer time to come out and engage in these projects. So we are going to pay people for their time so that those who are lower income can make it work and still participate. And then lastly, just being more intentional about, when we do a focus group or a listening session, that we work with underrepresented communities in doing that. And then just wrapping up here, some lessons learned on this early work we've done. A need to be intentional and devote time to bringing new voices to the process. Just hosting a different kind of meeting is not going to solve everything and make your processes 100% equitable. You might reach a couple new people we found, but getting the representation that matches the demographics of the locality, it requires more intentional work and more time. Secondly, actively recruiting and paying people for their time. That's something that I just spoke about. We haven't done it yet on a process, but I think we're finding that people aren't able to dedicate the amount of time they really need to get into a stand-up project because they're just too busy or can't afford to volunteer time. So doing that will hopefully make it more of a formal process and more likely to have better participation. Another point I'll share is that there can be mistrust. Not surprisingly, the same institutions who have perpetuated racist policies in the past are coming out to some of these communities and asking for them to participate, give their time. They don't believe sometimes that we really mean what we say when we come out. And so a demonstrated commitment to this work is what we've heard from some communities that they need in order to meaningfully participate. So that's something that we've, especially with Siri's work, have been trying to kind of formalize this work, get our decision makers on board so people can see that we really mean it when we say we want to hear from you. We want to improve quality of life for your community. And then I recognize that this last point is a little bit of a contradiction to my first one, but you also have to start from where you are. You can't wait until you have, all the pieces in place and perfectly well set up to start this work. It's important, start from where you are and continue to learn along the way. We have so much still to learn. We have so much more still that we can do, but you've got to start somewhere and see what you can do to start today. So lastly, I'll just share our contact information. If you have any questions about what we shared today, please feel free to reach out and stay in touch. And thank you so much for your time today. And I think now I'm going to turn it back over to our panel.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Siri. I will turn it over to the panel. I think we have time for one comment or question for Albemarle. I have one if nobody else does, but I want to give it to the panel. No? Okay, well, my question, and you kind of left us with this point, Rachel, but you also mentioned earlier, this idea of learning is ongoing. What would you say to a jurisdiction or any organization that is concerned that an equity initiative may fail or have unintended consequences, and therefore they may be hesitant to implement them? Well, how would you counter that or respond to that? Or anybody on the panel?
I'll make a quick response and then I'll see if Siri has anything to add. I will say you just have to be willing to be uncomfortable. This is really hard stuff, and people are going to be uncomfortable. The white people in the room are going to have to be okay with being uncomfortable when we talk about our racist past. And if you're not willing to do that, then you're not going to make any progress in this work.
I would 100% agree with Rachel. And I'd say, you know, something that someone said to me actually just the day before yesterday is they said, you know, this work isn't rocket science, but they didn't mean that in the usual, you know, like, oh, super complex. What they meant was we haven't figured it out yet, right? We know how to get a human being to the moon, right? But we don't yet know how to solve the questions around equity because we haven't done it yet. And so you can't be afraid to actually do here. And failure, I think, is in some ways inevitable because certainly we have failed on some of the things that we have done, but we haven't let individual failures stop us from taking on the whole thing. So we would just say, keep going.
Well, thank you. I think we're going to pivot to Darius now, and we'll still have time at the end for questions for the entire panel.
Okay. So good afternoon again, everybody. My name is Darius Johnson. I'm the communications manager for Eastern Shore Land Conservancy. And I just want to reiterate again, you know, for us at ESLC, this is really essentially a new process for us. We've always valued equity, but we haven't really taken some, you know, tangible, you know, forward-thinking, long-term steps towards making it a part of the fabric of who we are. So today, what I'm going to do is just talk a little bit about, you know, how we're approaching this within our organization and what some of our plans are. And then I also just want to state that I really appreciate being a part of this panel here today because I feel like with where we are at ESLC in this process, it's really valuable for me to be in this panel with other organizations who are at different stages. So like my colleagues on this panel, you know, I hope that on ESLC can be on the track that they are, you know, in the next year and in the years to come. So again, I really do appreciate that. So I know we don't have a ton of time left today. We want to have some time for a discussion at the end. So I'm going to try and go through mine pretty quickly. But basically, this process that we began at Eastern Shore Land Conservancy, you know, essentially is all about digging deeper and understanding what race means to us, what equity means to us. And so that's what you see here on this title slide, digging deeper, creating pathways to diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice and conservation. So that's the phrase that's been guiding us this past year. So I just want to take a moment just to start about, you know, who we are. And I'm just going to put it simply, you know, at Eastern Shore Land Conservancy, when I look around at my colleagues, our board members, our supporters, whether they're volunteers or whether they're donors, We're conservationists, we're history buffs. Some of us are birders, some of us are bikers, some of us are hunters, crisis managers, civic leaders, farmers, and plenty more. And as I say here in this last line, we are the Eastern Shore. We feel that the way that we live our individual lifestyles is a representation of just the greater Eastern Shore lifestyle. And we want to stay anchored in that because that's the way that we make sure that we stay connected to our communities. So a little bit about what we do. So Eastern Shore Land Conservancy, we're a land trust, an agricultural land trust. So we were formed in 1990 out of the urgency to protect agricultural lands from development and ultimately the Eastern Shore's backbone industries that relied on those agricultural lands and the health and sustainability of them. In a place like this, that's rural, people have always made a living off the land or off the water, getting their hands dirty or putting their boots to the ground. That's a lifestyle that people enjoy here, they're proud of, and they want it to sustain. So we take pride in being a nonprofit that strives to maintain that heritage and to empower those backbone industries, ultimately focusing on the prime agricultural lands that encompass this entire region. So our mission is to preserve and sustain the vibrant communities of Maryland's Eastern Shore and the lands and waters that connect them. And we work across lands, towns, and people in constant pursuit of our mission. So I just wanted to throw a little visual in here. This is the property that we protected in Dorchester County. I love it because you get a nice mix of the agricultural farmland, you get a nice view of forest and the changing season. And then also a tributary that likely flows into the Choptank River down there in Dorchester. This is what we protect. This is what it's all about. And we ultimately want to make sure that people understand the value of protecting this land and what it means to the entire landscape. So when I mention the entire landscape, just to frame it for you in a better context, we work across 6 counties on the Eastern Shore. So we work in Cecil County, Kent County, Queen Anne's County, Talbot County, Caroline County, and Dorchester County. Now, as I mentioned, the Eastern Shore, the lifestyle, the way of living, it's pretty, cookie cutter, from county to county. People in East County tend to make a living off the land. That's their primary means of getting by. But East County is unique in its own way. So for an organization like us, it's important for us to recognize those factors from county to county, their unique demographics, unique industries, anything that differentiates each of them, so we can work within these counties and with their people to be successful in achieving our mission. But really, over these past few years, we've definitely recognized a need to broaden our reach and broaden our scope. So we're actually seeking to form some statewide partnerships across the Delmarva Peninsula to advance and accelerate landscape level conservation through an initiative called Delmarva Oasis. So just to put it into some more context for you, we've protected 65,000 acres of land across the Eastern Shore since 1990, which is about 24% of the entire Delmarva Peninsula. And if you look to the right, we have a map that shows protected lands by state. And I believe this map is from either 2018 or 2009, so somewhat current. But basically with Delmarva Oasis and this initiative, we're trying to protect 50% of the peninsula by 2030. And as you look at this map, you can see where some of the gaps in land protection are. And what we recognize is that we need to align our conservation goals with the conservation goals of our neighboring states to close some of these gaps, whether it's going to create opportunities for recreation across state lines or whether it's for migratory hubs and corridors for wildlife, or wherever else that may be. But at the end of the day, to put it simply, it's a rising tide lifts all boats kind of mentality. Let's work with our partners to all achieve our collective missions and protect our quality of life here in the peninsula. So just to give a quick recap before I dive into what we're doing with equity, how we work, we focus on land preservation and stewardship. leveraging conservation easements and best management practices to protect land in perpetuity and to enhance the conservation values of the land we protect. We also focus on town vibrancy. So we work directly with our municipalities, supporting them in planning and zoning, or food access, or creating recreation and public access opportunities. We also focus on coastal resilience. One thing that we say is that the Eastern Shore is the third most vulnerable region to the impacts of climate change, specifically sea level rise, behind Louisiana and Florida. So it's really important for us to understand that identity and what that means, and to take responsibility to try and mitigate any adverse impacts that we see coming ahead. So we work with those same counties that we serve to help them with hazard mitigation plans, or any local and state government engagement around climate change and coastal resilience. And we also partner with regional universities on climate change research. And finally, we have an outdoor education program that's integrated with the regional school system, just to ensure that the next generation of kids, they understand the importance of being stewards of the Chesapeake Bay watershed, and just the abundance of opportunities that are out there within this field of work. So we went through our definitions earlier, all of us panelists. So this is the definition for equity that I shared. Equity to ESLC is ensuring that everyone has a chance to benefit from the land we protect. It means constantly and consistently recognizing when we are using or misusing our power to impact the Eastern Shore quality of life for all people, and having the moral courage to do what's right for the common good. So understanding this, we recognize to achieve equity, we must dig deeper. So basically over these next few slides, I'm gonna just go into what digging deeper has looked like for us over the past year. So let's get on that. So this is a rough timeline of some of the things that we focus on over this past year as it pertains to equity. A lot of this really kicked off with the death of George Floyd, and just from some conversations internally about what that meant to us. So we actually released a statement of our own about racism and conservation. So we released that in April. And as a communications manager, I'll be transparent in saying that I wasn't comfortable with writing or putting that out unless I felt like my organization was going to take the necessary steps to act on it. So what you see in the next several months, on the slide, is some of the actions that we've taken. So what we did is we actually turned that statement into an internal outreach series in which we invited past and present board members and staff members to have a dialogue about how we all connect with the land, how race relations has changed our perspective of the society that we live in over this past year, and then taking those two questions and figuring out where the gaps are for Eastern Shore Land Conservancy in empowering and achieving equity in the work that we do. So basically in August, we had our first conversation at our headquarters at the Eastern Shore Conservation Center. We had a second conversation at a local farm of one of our former board members. And then also in September, we actually joined the planning committee for the Audubon National Society's annual Taking Nature Black Conference, which is a really important space for us to be in because it gives us opportunity to connect with an audience that we don't usually connect with. But it also opens up a lot of opportunities for shared learning and understanding about just what race means in the conservation field, and what our role is in that. So following that, in September, we had another conversation at Turner's Creek, which is where our education program is housed. And then, of course, I had a phone call. 1 second. Okay. And then in October, we also participated for the Chesapeake Conservation Partnership's annual meeting, in which we co-led a workshop on rural equity and help in conservation. And then finally, here today, we're participating in this workshop for you all. So this timeline basically shows that we've spent a lot of time understanding our own role and our own voice within this space, and making sure that we're leveraging our voice in the best ways possible just to make a tangible impact. So I know we have a few minutes left. So what I want to do really quick is just give you all a glimpse of some of the conversations that we've had. So I have an audio recording that I want to share that was from one of our Digging Deeper conversations. So what I'm going to suggest is that you just take a few minutes to take advantage of the time and space to reflect on what happens in what's discussed in this conversation, but also just what our panelists have shared today. I think it'll be good fodder for discussion later on.
I have a lot of questions, but it's good to be here to see so many influential people. And it makes me feel good to know that we're trying to do something for the Eastern Shore, because we are in dire need for a lot of help. And I hope we can come together and do something great. Thank you very much.
So when it comes to the equity standpoint, I'm just going to put it straight out there, just in numbers. So we've protected over 300 properties across the Eastern Shore since 1990. That's over 65,000 acres. And only one of those properties is held by a black family, and that's in Dorchester County. So when you think about that, and you think about where money comes from to those families, from the federal government, from the state government, DNR, the U.S. Army, you name them, these different groups who want to protect land for their own goals too, meeting with the landowners' goals, none of that money has flowed to African Americans.
It is systemic. It is systemic, but that's the structural, just in terms of what ESLC does, that is one of the structural inequities of the process according to what it is that we do. So it's no surprise then, is it, that there's only one black family that has chosen to put their farmland, their acquired wealth, their land. And I'm curious because in an easement program, it doesn't surprise me.
Sitting here listening, and I hear where if you have a lot of land, then you have value.
Yeah.
I only have a half of an acre of land in the community. I would like to know the advantage of your committee towards me and my surrounding people in the same area that I'm in, the advantage they will have with your committee.
It's not significant, sir, to be quite honest with you. From my perspective, the advantage of a committee like that to you personally, to the Eastern Shore Land Conservancy, to you personally, in terms of this, not so much.
Right.
In terms of the collective impact of what Eastern Shore Land Conservancy does, maybe more, okay? But it's like, it isn't something that would necessarily personally benefit you unless you value the agricultural history, how do I say, unless you value the landscape around you, spaces like this.
Invariably, our properties are not included. Black people's properties do not get included in the scale of things.
Why is that?
Because you are not a part of the fabric. You're not a part of the fabric. So therefore you're overlooked. It is not inclusive. It thinks that because in most of the towns that are around here where they're doing things, we are included in a peripheral status. We're not the main components of the towns. I don't say cities. We don't really have any cities over here. We have big towns, little towns. And when it comes to farmland, there's never discussions with descendants of enslaved Africans about how we can partake in the growth processes. Not to come and take land under eminent domain. That's not working. But to be a part of the fabric. Because you're not included. And so when things get done, you're not asked. And you don't know anything about it until you see something going up. You say, what is that? But when the final deal goes down, we're not included. We're not included. And that takes place on county levels, that takes place on state levels, that takes place on organizational levels. Eastern Shore Land Conservancy is no different. But once you kind of get yourself in there, and if you have an opportunity to do, then maybe things could change. But if you never get in it, maybe things will never change. I'm not interested in anybody coming here telling Donna and I what to do. However, we want to be a part of the planning process.
And I said one of the things that we fail to do with our kids is to let them know how important the land is, because this is where we get our food from. You know, I haven't had a garden probably 25 years, but I do know how to grow tomatoes, cucumbers, and so on and so forth. I do know how to go out there and cut a tree down without it falling on me. It's little things that we need to bring back to our community to want to stay here. you know. And as far as like what you were talking about, the trails, I've been coming here for 15 years, and I'll have a conversation with these ladies, and she invited me to come back yesterday. She was telling me about today, and some of the things that were shared about the trails. It's real important. I mean, people are looking for something to do.
We're social beings.
Right.
We are social beings. We all need each other, but we try to become individuals. When I was a kid, we all needed each other. We helped each other. Now it's everybody's an individual.
Right.
I don't want to go on and on and on. But that's the way I feel about it.
You're right.
Yeah, I've been around a long time. I've seen a lot. But I see this is the 21st century. But you sit and think about the hatred that is out here today. It's disgusting.
Yeah.
You know, like we come a long ways from slavery and from the caveman and the jungle man or whatever you want to call us. So we need to be respected, and we need, in order to be respected, you got to give respect. All of us have to look up at each other and say, "Hey, you know better than I am, and I'm no better than you are."
Thank you, Darius.
So
Sorry, go ahead.
no worries, no worries. So just to wrap it up really quick, as you all can hear from that, we have a lot of reckoning and more understanding and listening to do at Eastern Shore Land Conservancy. So that's how we intend to move forward, continuing to do some deep active listening in the community. Hopefully that can give us, the right tools and mechanisms that we can put in place to ensure that this sustains and that equity stays top of mind for us, but then also our partners throughout the region. So that's going to be really important for us. And I know we only have a few minutes, left. So these are my final takeaways. Skim over this while you have a chance. But the main thing I want to say is just be real, find joy in being a student of the culture. And then also anchor yourself in the communities, in the grassroots as you aim to influence policies, budgets across states, municipalities, and organizations at the high level. And then these are just some links and resources if you'd like to reach out to me, or if you'd like to check out our diversity statement and understand more about our mentality with this. And then also the annual Taking Nature Black Conference, registration actually opened for that today. So, if you want to dive into this some more with some more people, that's a great opportunity too. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Darius. And I encourage the rest of the panelists to turn on their cameras and see if anybody has a specific question or feedback for Darius before I'll read off the general questions we've received. It was a powerful recording. Thank you for sharing that, Darius.
Yeah, I have a question for Darius, because for some of us, and I believe that Siri or Rachel mentioned this in their presentation, we are doing work sometimes in places that we don't necessarily hail from, and maybe some of our colleagues do not hail from the places where we're doing some of our planning work. So for you being a native son of the region in which you're doing your work, how do you think that has been an advantage as you're working on issues of equity, or do you think it has been an advantage, or is it neutral? I'm interested in that particular experience.
That's a good question. I mean, just being honest, it's exhausting and it's empowering at the same time. I say that because hailing from here, having generations of families that have gone back, I can trace my family back 400 years on both sides. It's deep rooted. So I've had to deal with it my entire life in many different ways. So that's the exhausting part of it. But the empowering part of it is knowing that I'm with an organization that is a trusted regional stakeholder that cares enough to make this a part of what we focus on. And I know I have people around me who want to empower me to make an impact in that same way. So I don't know, it's one of those things where it's, it kind of feels like a responsibility to myself, but then also just others. When I have kids, they're going to go run across these same fields and do the same woods that I did, frequent the same communities and places that I did. So I want to make sure that they feel good about being here too. So that's the empowering part. But I appreciate that question. First time somebody's asked me that.
All right. Well, I know we're running out of time. I'm not gonna be able to get to all the questions. We might run a little past 2:30 for those who can stay. So we have a number of questions in the question box. And I might have to skip over some just to make sure I want to get to the ones directed to specific panelists. But first one is somebody's asking about EPA's EJ screen, saying that it seems to provide indicators on the possible problems in the community. But I would think more critical are the community discussions and strategies that this information may highlight. So what they're asking, it's like, have you used EPA's EJ screen? Have you combined it with the community insights as part of your equity work? I mean, I will say that I agree. I've reviewed the EJ screen. They make updates regularly, and it does have a lot of public health and environmental indicators that probably align really well with those areas that are most affected by inequitable decisions of the past. Another resource to consider. Here's one for Alina. Why are people in the Planning Academy predominantly female?
I honestly do not know. I can only say that that is predominantly who has applied. So in terms of who participates, kind of mirrors that. In general, when we do follow demographics, we have tried to go back and kind of address when we see, for example, geographically that there's not a lot of people applying for a certain part of the city. And then we usually try to work with the community planner in that particular part of the city to do more targeted outreach. However, for the gender gap that was identified, we haven't really done a targeted campaign towards men, and maybe we should try to identify some organizations in the future to try to balance things out a bit more.
Thank you. Next question is for Stephanie. How is the public involvement used in conducting the equity analysis, or how does the when you have your impact, you're using your equity lens, how does the public involvement inform that?
Okay, so we have only set forth one citywide plan that utilized the equity lens. So that was our sustainability plan that was updated in 2019. So it was first established in 2009 and 2019. In the development of the sustainability plan, we actually use sustainability ambassadors. So something very similar to what I was hearing Rachel mention is that we want to compensate people for their time. Oftentimes we pay consultants to find regular people to tell us what regular people want, when really we could just be maybe eliminating a bit of the middleman and getting right to impacted community members. So we had, I believe, north of 1,500 responses, but we had about 300 ambassadors, and they had small budgets to have a team of people to go to the farmers markets, the bus stops, public housing, wherever it was that they had personal connections, to ask people some simple questions. What do they like about their experience living in Baltimore? What could they see improved? And I think one other question, it was only 2 or 3 questions. And we used that response to kind of gauge, where we could expand beyond some of the core environmental work of our sustainability plan to certain things around human systems. And one of the things that was really interesting about that process was that I was not actually working at the Department of Planning when this process was happening. I was just a member of my community that was pretty involved. And one of the things that I really commend sustainability staff for doing is that they were looking for population racial parity, and the response is much to what Alina was mentioning with like how we've been trying to make sure that people participating in the Planning Academy, are representative of the city. And they recognize that white women were overrepresented in responses, and Black men specifically were underrepresented in responses, and Black people generally. And so I was very involved with the Urban League at that time. So they consulted with new consultants that had different types of relationships with grassroots organizations in Baltimore. And they did a series of kind of smaller focus groups to really target, to ensure that they were getting more responses that were representative. And one of the things I think was so important about that is that sometimes people have equity goals, and if they fall short of them in process, there's kind of a, oh, well, we tried. So the fact that there is a pause and a recalibration midway to say, hey, we can see we're on a trajectory that's probably going to fall short of the goal. We're going to have to recalibrate mid kind of planning process, and then see if there's some new ways to get some new voices involved. That's how I was first exposed to their planning process, is that I was part of that group they were trying to bring in to make sure they weren't missing voices. So now we're in the phase of implementing this plan with fidelity to public input. And that's going to be another kind of challenge, because one could argue the easy part was, providing these various on-ramps for public engagement, providing resources, providing funding for people to participate. The next part would be across city agencies, and in the face of COVID, having some challenges engaging with people to ensure that as we're implementing various phases of them, that we are helping. So one of the other things that we did do that was different is we started using a platform, and Alina, you can correct me if I'm pronouncing it incorrectly, because it changed, the company changed its name. We were introduced to it as Civic Comment, and I think it now goes by Convevo or some other type of name. But essentially, I know at the federal level, when people are taking public comment on a rule, you would just go to regulations.gov and put in that bit of comment feedback. But a lot of our localities kind of different ways of doing that. So by using Civic Comment, it was a way for people to give comment directly into the draft of the sustainability, and then other people could see your comment and even respond to your comment. And we thought it made the whole commenting process more alive, because sometimes people won't give comment because they assume someone else covered it. And if you go in there and you realize something wasn't mentioned at all, then you realize I really need to get in there and lift this up. But we also did do pop-up in-person opportunities. We have an annual sustainability town hall, and there was another method for us to get feedback on the draft plan in person with sticky notes in our traditional kind of planning efforts. But we always wanted to make sure we did things that were accessible to public transit, were accessible for different physical abilities, and that also we were providing something that could stimulate people either online, in person, or in another method.
Thank you, Stephanie. Christine, feel free to cut us off if you'd like, but I'm going to ask two more questions. I know we're past no time. We thank everybody for holding on with us. This one's for Darius. How does a land conservancy organization work with the planning department, like Kent County? It says Delaware, or Delaware, I guess, to promote equity.
Yeah. So I guess I can answer this in a few ways. The first that comes to mind for us, so our coastal resilience program works most closely with planning departments around the region. So the thing that we found on the Eastern Shore, especially being a pretty conservative region, is that climate change hasn't been much of a point of emphasis for a lot of local governments. So I believe maybe back in 2013, we started focusing on coastal resilience. Just building out, our knowledge base and our thought leadership within that space, and started to, do some engagement and outreach to local municipalities, just having them understand how we can support their efforts to build resilience against the impacts of climate change. But even just pointing out what are the impacts of those, just identifying them for them. So that really led us along a path of working with a lot of counties to develop some of these hazard mitigation plans, or more specific plans, to where they could, come up with some solutions to the specific climate change impacts they're seeing within their counties or within their towns. And then that eventually led to us forming the Eastern Shore Climate Adaptation Partnership. That's a quarterly facilitation group that consists of planners around the region from each county. So we get together, we share knowledge, we pool together funding for additional research. We haven't got to many implementation projects yet, but that's something that we're working on as we continue to build that engagement. But that program probably works most directly with planners. The next program in mind is our towns program, which focuses on, as I mentioned, planning, zoning, food access, creating recreational opportunities and public access opportunities. So we have a couple projects around the region now. We're trying to build out some trails. So obviously that does fit in with comprehensive plans for each county or within the town's plans. So we got to stay, closely connect with them to make sure that, things are aligned every step of the way. Then from a land protection perspective, Eastern Shore counties are pretty good with understanding their agricultural value that they have, in their surrounding landscape. So if you look through any of those plans, I mean, there's plenty in there about agricultural land protection. So it's one of those things where we really don't have to engage local planners that much on the land protection side because it's already ingrained in the DNA of what each of those offices do and enforce on a regular basis. But I will say that a lot of counties are currently going through rezoning processes. So we've started to reinsert our voice back into the conversation from a land protection perspective, just to make sure that the rezoning process is cognizant of the land protection needs that the community sees for the future, but also that we see as a need for the future as well. So I guess the kind of wrap it up and give you a short answer, just maintaining communication with them and maintaining an understanding of, what problems and challenges and opportunities that they have within those, each of those offices.
All right, I'm gonna combine two questions and we'll please keep this short, but they're kind of more in the line of resources or specific like logistical suggestions. One is about any insight for small localities that are interested in doing an action plan or incorporating equity into staff reports who haven't done it before. So think about small localities, probably have smaller staff as well. And then finally, is to combine with that, is there a list or a template about core amendments, core policies, core processes, and programs that, or the resources like that a jurisdiction could go find and then modify it to their own use. So those are kind of, I'm trying to combine those. So if anybody has real quick answers, suggestions for resources, go at it.
I personally, and other folks, please pop in here. I honestly think your best resource is other localities who are doing the work. I've found folks to be really generous with their time and with whatever sort of materials or processes that they've developed, because there isn't like an easy 1, 2, 3, and so much depends on the context of your organization and sort of the things that you're working with and what kind of resource you have available. I would say for smaller or if you don't have a lot of resource in terms of staff capacity, then you would not be unlike Albemarle County, because our Office of Equity and Inclusion only has 2 full-time folks in it. So the process of getting it done really requires leaning on the rest of your organizational leadership and bringing other folks into the fold so that it's not you who's doing all the work of equity, right? Your organization has to be working, not just one particular person. So I'll shut up because other folks might have thoughts on that too.
I think a lot of the work that we're doing is so emerging. There's not a lot necessarily that we can always look to. I know that as a city, we're a part of GARE, which is an organization that helps localities that are thinking about equity issues just more broadly, not just within the context of planning. So there's some good resources there. Policy Link has some really good resources across different size communities, so not just for the big cities, but also medium and smaller localities that might be worth looking into. I also think that, something to just kind of like remember with this work, and I just wanted to say this because it was really on something that Rachel said about people not wanting to be uncomfortable. And I wanted to say something then, but I held back, but then Darius said something, so I feel like I have to say it. He is already, and me and a lot of other people, I'm uncomfortable outside of my 9 to 5 because I'm living within a system of racial, just within a structurally racist framework. So this is my life. I don't get to clock out of my concern. So we're asking our colleagues to hold space for whatever level of discomfort is necessary for them to be professionally competent. And I think that's the framing we have to do around equity. It's not a plus. It's not some extra stuff. It's not like a superlative. Literally, equity work is about professional competence. It's just like we all expect you to be able to use the Microsoft suite it's going to be eventually a point of just being competent. Are you able to address these issues? So I just wanted to say that, because I know that I've been asked as recently as a few weeks ago by someone in city government, just to be quite frank, about, could you recommend like an equity trainer that will make sure no one in my office really feels bad about anything? And I'm like, so you really don't want equity training, is really what you're basically saying to me. But that's kind of, a reality, is that people feel like there's going to be a shortcut to short-circuiting literally hundreds of years of baked-in policy that doesn't necessarily announce itself as racist or inequitable. It was just designed without even considering other people's humanity. So I just felt like I needed to lift that up.
Yeah, and I just want to co-sign all of that first off. I really, really do. Because I think, what you said about people wanting a shortcut, it gets away from the essence of what this all is all about in the first place. It's about treating somebody right. It's about having a relationship with somebody who has noticeable or maybe unnoticeable differences from you, and accepting and acknowledging those. So I go back to some of the points that I had to kind of skip through at the end of my presentation, but at the end of the day, just be real. Be real with yourself. Who you are at the core of your identity, figure that out, and then go and learn something else about somebody else who doesn't look like you or didn't come up like you, and figure out where the common ground is, and then work from there. I think that's the main thing that we can do to try and make an impact, outside of any plans or anything like that. Just be real with who you are.
Thank you, Darius. I think Christine showed up, so I think she's well, I want to thank Christine for guiding us through this and being letting us have a little extra time. Thanks.
Absolutely, and frankly, I would love to go on, because this feels good. This session just feels good. But there's a lot of questions that are still unanswered. So I think what I'm going to suggest, actually, if it's okay with all of our panelists, I'm going to send everyone the questions, so that hopefully you can follow up with those folks that didn't get their questions answered, because there's still some really, really great ones. Just a couple things to wrap up with. We are recording the session. It will be available on our YouTube channel soon. Just kind of search Planning Webcast Series and we'll pop up. And we'll also have a PDF copy of this entire slide deck available on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. So thanks to everyone for joining us. Thanks to this awesome panel. This was really great. I appreciate all of you and all of your words and just being real. And this is obviously a very important topic, and we hope to have you all back soon. Thanks everyone for joining us, and stay safe, and we will talk next time. Thanks everybody.
Happy holidays.
See you, everybody.
Happy holidays.